The night sky burned orange and red from fires below. Inside his Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter, Oberleutnant Franz Becker scanned the darkness through his cockpit window. His radar operator behind him shouted over the engine noise. The screen showed something impossible. Dozens of targets. No, hundreds. All moving together like one massive animal crawling across the sky. Becker grabbed his radio. His voice cracked as he spoke to his commander on the ground. Massive formation coming in. Flying low. Flying fast. He paused, his throat tight. They are not Americans. These are the Canadians. Every German pilot knew what that meant. They could handle the American bombers. The big silver B-17s came during the day at 25,000 feet. You could see them coming from miles away. They flew in neat boxes, slow and steady. Their formations were easy to predict. German fighters had learned the patterns. They knew where to attack, when to break away, when to come back around. Against the Americans, 7 out of every 100 German pilots who went up did not come back. Those were bad odds, but pilots could live with them. But the Canadians were different. The Canadians owned the night. They flew Lancaster MKX bombers that Canadian factories built with different engines, stronger engines. These planes carried 22,000 pounds of bombs. That was almost 3 times what a B-17 could carry. The Lancasters flew at 18,000 feet, lower than the Americans, and they flew at 275 miles per hour. That made them faster than many German night fighters at the same height. When the Canadians came, 12 out of every 100 German pilots never made it home. The numbers told the story. Fighting the Canadians was almost twice as deadly. Becker had been flying night missions for 2 years. He had shot down 11 Allied bombers. 8 were British. 2 were American B-24s that got lost and wandered into his area. 1 was a Canadian Lancaster. He remembered that night in January. The Lancaster had been damaged and flying alone, separated from its group. Even wounded, it had taken him 3 attack runs to bring it down. The rear gunner kept firing until the plane hit the ground. Becker had nightmares about it. He never wanted to face a healthy Lancaster with a full crew again. The formation Becker saw on his radar that March night was not a few lost planes. This was a bomber stream, a new tactic the Canadians had perfected. They flew so close together that German radar could not tell where one plane ended and another began. They came in waves that lasted 45 minutes or more. By the time a German fighter shot down one Lancaster and turned around to find another target, the sky was full of bombs falling and fires rising. The smoke made it impossible to see. The fires blinded German searchlights. The chaos protected the bombers. In England, at Royal Canadian Air Force bases scattered across Yorkshire, the men who flew these missions were young. Most were 22 years old. They came from small towns in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Alberta. They grew up driving tractors on dark roads, flying small planes over empty wilderness, hunting in forests where you had to see in low light or you went home empty-handed. The Canadian Air Force chose these men because they could see at night better than city boys. They could fly by instinct when instruments failed. They were not fancy. They were not famous. But they were deadly. Their commander was Air Vice Marshal Clifford McEwen. Everyone called him Black Mike because of his dark hair and his dark moods. He did not smile much. He did not care about making friends with British generals. McEwen had one job: destroy German factories and cities so completely that Germany could not keep fighting. British commanders thought he was too rough, too willing to risk his men. They whispered that Canadians were brave but reckless. They gave the Canadians the hardest missions, the ones nobody else wanted, thinking maybe the colonials would fail and learn some respect. McEwen did not fail. He studied the numbers. American bombers flew high because they thought altitude meant safety. But German fighters just climbed higher. American bombs fell from so far up that wind scattered them across miles. Half missed their targets. British bombers flew at night but spread out, each crew finding their own way to the target. German night fighters picked them off one by one like wolves hunting scattered sheep. McEwen saw a different path. The Lancaster MKX used Packard Merlin engines built in Canada. These engines were slightly different from British versions. They could lift 4,000 pounds more weight while flying just as fast. That meant his bombers could carry more bombs than anyone else. More bombs meant more damage. More damage meant fewer missions needed. Fewer missions meant more crews survived. But the bigger idea was the bomber stream. Instead of spreading out, McEwen wanted his Lancasters to fly close together in one continuous column. They would overwhelm German defenses by arriving all at once. German radar would see a solid wall. German searchlights would not know which plane to follow. German fighters would dive into a sky full of bombers and gunners. Every direction would have danger. British commanders said it would never work. Too many planes too close together meant collisions. It meant friendly fire from gunners shooting at shadows. It meant if one plane got hit and exploded, it could take others with it. The American generals said night bombing was wasteful. You could not see your targets. You could not prove what you destroyed. Daylight precision was the only scientific way to win a war. McEwen listened to all of them. Then he ignored them. He had flown combat missions himself. He knew what worked in a staff meeting often died in the sky. He trusted his young crews from the Canadian countryside. He trusted the Lancaster MKX that Canadian workers built with their hands. And he trusted that the Luftwaffe, which had learned to counter every other Allied tactic, had no answer for hundreds of heavy bombers arriving in one unstoppable wave through the darkness. In March 1944, as Oberleutnant Becker turned his night fighter toward the incoming stream of Canadian bombers, he knew he was flying into something new, something German pilots had no tactics to counter yet. His hands were shaking on the control stick. Below him, the Ruhr Valley factories glowed with blast furnaces that made steel for German tanks. In minutes, those factories would be buried in fire. And Becker had to fly straight into that fire to do his duty. The Canadians were coming, and nothing had prepared him for what that meant. The Lancaster MKX looked like any other British bomber from a distance. 4 engines, 2 tail fins, a long body painted black for night raids. But Canadian factory workers in Malton, Ontario had built something special. The wingspan stretched 102 feet wide. Under each wing hung 2 Packard Merlin engines. Each engine produced 1,640 horsepower. American car makers built these engines using British designs, but made them stronger, tougher, able to run harder for longer. The real magic was in the bomb bay. British Lancasters could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs on a good night. The Canadian version could carry 22,000 pounds. That extra weight came from better engines and careful engineering. Every pound mattered. More bombs meant more destruction. More destruction meant winning faster. A single Lancaster MKX could carry what 3 American B-17 bombers carried together. The B-17 topped out at 8,000 pounds and needed 3 crews, 3 planes, 3 times the fuel to match what one Canadian Lancaster delivered. Speed mattered too. At 18,000 feet, a fully loaded Lancaster MKX cruised at 275 miles per hour. German Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighters flew about the same speed at that height, maybe a bit slower when climbing. This meant German pilots could not easily catch Lancasters from behind. They had to attack from the side or below, positions where the Lancaster's gunners had clear shots. The bomber also had range. With a full bomb load, it could fly 2,530 miles. That meant taking off from England, flying deep into Germany to Berlin or Munich, dropping tons of explosives, and flying home. Few bombers in the world could do that. In June 1943, McEwen prepared his first major test. The target was Cologne, a city on the Rhine River full of factories and rail yards. He gathered 97 Lancaster MKXs from 6 different Canadian squadrons. The crews had trained for months on formation flying at night. They practiced staying close together without crashing. They learned to trust their instruments when they could not see the plane flying 50 feet away through clouds and darkness. The night of the raid, the weather was terrible. Thick clouds covered Germany. Rain pounded the windscreens. British commanders suggested calling it off. McEwen refused. His bombers had a new technology called GH, a radio navigation system that let them find targets even when they could not see the ground. 2 radio stations in England sent signals. Equipment on the bombers measured the time difference between signals. Mathematics turned those measurements into exact positions. Crews could bomb through clouds and hit targets they never saw with their eyes. The 97 Lancasters flew in a stream 45 miles long. They arrived over Cologne within 45 minutes of each other. The first planes dropped flares that burned bright red and green, marking the target. The following planes aimed for the flares. In those 45 minutes, they dropped 1,500 tons of bombs. The ground shook. Buildings collapsed. Fire spread from block to block. German anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into clouds. Night fighters circled, confused, trying to find targets in a sky full of bombers. By the time German commanders figured out where to send their fighters, most of the Canadians were already heading home. German reports from that night showed their frustration. One commander wrote that it was impossible to guide fighters effectively. Targets were everywhere at once. Another wrote that by the time a fighter reached one bomber, 10 more had already dropped their loads. The old tactics of hunting scattered bombers one by one did not work against a concentrated stream, but success brought doubt from unexpected places. Royal Air Force commanders in London looked at the results and shrugged. They assigned the Canadians to fly diversionary raids, missions meant to draw German attention away from British bombers hitting other targets. The Canadians were good, the British admitted, but they were still colonials. Let them do the dangerous work while British crews got the glory missions. American generals were even worse. They believed daylight precision bombing was the only smart strategy. Their flying fortresses went out in broad daylight with fighter escorts. They aimed carefully at specific factories and bridges. Night bombing seemed primitive to them, almost medieval. You could not see what you were hitting. How could you measure success? The Americans published studies showing daylight raids were more efficient. They politely suggested the Canadians were wasting resources and lives. Even Winston Churchill had doubts. In private meetings, he questioned whether Canadian crews were temperamentally suited for the grinding stress of night after night of bombing missions. The comment was not meant to be cruel. Churchill worried about all his bomber crews, but the question revealed how even allies underestimated what the Canadians could do. One man saw the truth clearly. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris commanded all of Royal Air Force Bomber Command. Other officers called him Bomber Harris behind his back. Some thought he was too obsessed with destroying German cities. But Harris understood war. He understood that wars were won by breaking the enemy's ability to fight. Factories made that ability. Workers in those factories kept the machines running. Destroy enough factories, kill enough production, and Germany would collapse. In March 1944, Harris flew to Yorkshire to watch a Canadian raid on Stuttgart. He stood in the control room as radio reports came back. The Canadians had hit their target perfectly. Fires burned across 15 square miles. German industrial output from Stuttgart dropped by 60% overnight. Harris made his decision that night. He assigned the Canadians to lead Operation Hurricane, the largest concentrated bombing campaign the war had seen so far. If anyone could break Germany's war machine, it was these rough young men from the Canadian wilderness. The proof came in September 1944 at Bochum. This city in the Ruhr Valley made steel and coal, the foundation of German tank production. McEwen sent 371 Lancaster Mauxes. They flew in a bomber stream that stretched across the night sky like a river of metal and fire. The raid lasted 52 minutes. When it ended, 83% of Bochum's industrial buildings were destroyed or damaged beyond use. Blast furnaces melted into twisted metal. Coal mines collapsed. Rail yards became fields of broken track and overturned train cars. German interceptor success rate that night was 4.2%. Out of every 100 German fighters that went up, fewer than 5 managed to shoot down a Canadian bomber. The rest flew through walls of defensive fire, dodged falling bombs, and landed with damaged planes and shattered nerves. German pilots started requesting transfers. Some claimed illness. Others simply refused to fly against Canadian formations. The numbers told a story that no propaganda could hide. The Canadians were winning, and the Luftwaffe was running out of pilots willing to face them. The Lancaster MKX was not a miracle weapon. It was just a good bomber with strong engines and smart tactics. But in the hands of determined crews led by a commander who refused to accept limits, it became the weapon German pilots feared most. The Black Stream had arrived, and nothing in the German arsenal could stop it. Between August 1944 and April 1945, the Canadian 6th Group flew 40,822 combat missions. That number is hard to imagine. It meant that every single night, sometimes twice a night, waves of black Lancaster bombers lifted off from English airfields and headed into German skies. They dropped 126,122 tons of bombs. That weight equals the mass of 1,000 blue whales, or 63,000 cars. The bombs fell on factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and cities. Wherever they fell, Germany's ability to make weapons died. The cost to the Luftwaffe was staggering. German night fighter units lost 1,344 aircraft trying to stop the Canadian raids. Each plane that went down took its crew with it. Most night fighters carried 2 men, a pilot, and a radar operator. That meant nearly 3,000 trained German air crew died fighting the Canadians in those 9 months. The Luftwaffe could not replace them fast enough. Training a night fighter pilot took a year. Germany did not have a year. Germany did not even have months. The survival numbers told an even darker story for German pilots. When they went up against Canadian bomber streams, only 68 out of every 100 came back alive. Compare that to fighting American daylight bombers, where 85 out of every 100 survived. The mathematics was brutal and clear. Fighting Americans was dangerous. Fighting Canadians was almost certain death. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Jonen survived the war and wrote a book about his experiences years later. He flew a Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter and shot down 34 Allied bombers before the war ended. In his book, he wrote about the Canadians with a respect that bordered on terror. We called them der schwarze Strom, the black stream, he wrote. You would see them on radar like a solid wall moving across Germany. Pick one off, and his wingmen would close the gap instantly. They flew as if they knew they owned the night. And they did own it. We were just trying to survive in their sky. Another German pilot, Hans Joachim Jabs, who shot down 50 bombers during the war, put it differently in an interview decades later. The Americans you could predict. They came during the day. They flew high. They followed patterns. The Canadians? They came in waves. Any weather, any moon phase. Always lower than we expected. Always faster. And there were always so many of them that you knew even if you got one, there were 50 more behind it ready to kill you. The fear was not just in the minds of pilots. German anti-aircraft crews on the ground dreaded the sound of Merlin engines at night. Those engines had a specific sound, a deep thrumming roar that was different from German planes or American bombers. When you heard that sound growing louder in the darkness, you knew you had maybe 2 minutes before the bomb started falling. 2 minutes to find cover. 2 minutes to say a prayer. 2 minutes before the earth shook and buildings came apart and fire filled the air. The physical experience of being under a Canadian raid was something no training could prepare anyone for. First came the sound of engines, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all running together in a mechanical symphony that made the air vibrate. Then came the whistling of falling bombs, a sound that started high and dropped lower as the bombs fell faster. Then the impacts. The ground jumped, your teeth rattled in your skull. The air got sucked out of your lungs. Flash after flash of light turned night into a hellish orange day. The smell of explosives mixed with dust and burning wood and melting metal. If you survived the first wave, you had maybe 3 minutes before the next wave arrived. This went on for 45 minutes or more. By December 1944, the Canadians had 428 Lancaster MKXs in the air. Other Royal Air Force groups started copying Canadian tactics. The bomber stream became standard doctrine. Everyone wanted to fly the way the Canadians flew, because everyone could see it worked. But the Canadians stayed the deadliest because they had been doing it longest. They knew the tricks. They knew how to adjust formations in bad weather. They knew which altitudes confused German radar. They knew how to support each other when fighters attacked. The contrast with American bombers became impossible to ignore. B-17 Flying Fortresses flew at 25,000 to 30,000 feet during daylight. They were predictable. They were slower. They carried lighter bomb loads. The B-24 Liberator carried a bit more than the B-17, but still only about half what a Lancaster could carry. American bombers needed fighter escorts to survive. Without P-51 Mustangs protecting them, German fighters tore through B-17 formations like sharks through fish. The Lancasters flew at 18,000 to 20,000 feet in total darkness with massive bomb loads and needed no escorts because German night fighters could barely find them in the chaos of the bomber stream. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They created a new tactic called Wild Sau, which meant wild boar in German. Instead of using radar to guide night fighters to targets, they sent fighters up to circle over cities being bombed. The fighters used the light from fires and searchlights to spot bombers. It was desperate and dangerous. Fighters sometimes crashed into each other in the darkness or got shot down by their own anti-aircraft guns. The tactic killed almost as many German pilots as it did Canadian bombers. German engineers installed upward-firing cannons in night fighters. They called this system Schräge Musik, which meant slanted music, a German jazz term. The idea was simple. Fly underneath a bomber where its gunners could not see you. Fire up into the bomb bay or fuel tanks. Watch it explode. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, flying underneath a formation of Lancasters meant you were in the middle of the bomber stream with targets all around you and nowhere to hide. Many German pilots who used Schräge music successfully died minutes later when another Lancaster's gunner spotted them. Despite all these innovations and desperate tactics, German success rates kept falling. By March 1945, fewer than 6 out of every 100 German fighters that engaged Canadian formations managed to shoot down a bomber. The Luftwaffe was not just losing, it was being destroyed. The bombing had consequences nobody expected. As Canadian raids made factories unusable, Germany started moving production underground. They dug tunnels into mountains. They built assembly lines in caves. Slave laborers worked in the darkness, putting together jet, engines, and rockets. But moving underground meant production slowed down. It meant more workers got sick from bad air and no sunlight. It meant transportation became almost impossible because you could not easily move parts and materials into caves and tunnels. The Canadian bombing achieved what American daylight raids could not. It did not just destroy factories, it disrupted the entire system that kept German war production running. The numbers showed the impact clearly. In the final year of the war, 26% of all the bombs dropped by Royal Air Force Bomber Command came from 6th Group. The Canadians were only 1/8 of the total bomber force, but they dropped more than 1/4 of the bombs. They flew more missions. They hit harder. They came back and did it again the next night and the night after that. German civilians started calling Canadian bombing raids Terrorangriffe, terror attacks. The name was propaganda, but it revealed real fear. When the Canadians came, you could not predict what would survive. Entire neighborhoods disappeared in flames. Water mains burst. Gas lines exploded. Hospitals collapsed. The raids broke something in the German population's will. They stopped believing their government's promises that Germany would win. They stopped believing the Luftwaffe could protect them. They just tried to survive one more night. The black stream kept coming, night after night, month after month, until there was almost nothing left to bomb. When the war ended in May 1945, the Canadian 6th Group had flown more than 40,000 combat sorties. 814 Lancaster MKXs had been shot down or crashed. Each plane carried 7 crew members. That meant nearly 6,000 young Canadians died in the night skies over Germany. But those numbers told only part of the story. The casualty rate for 6th Group was 9.8%. That meant fewer than 10 out of every 100 missions ended with a lost aircraft. Compare that to the overall Royal Air Force Bomber Command average of 12.3%. The Canadians, who flew the most dangerous missions against the most heavily defended targets, had a better survival rate than everyone else. Their tactics worked. Their training worked. Their courage worked. Air Vice Marshal Clifford MacEwan survived the war but never spoke much about it afterward. He retired from the Air Force in 1946 and moved to a quiet farm in Ontario. When reporters asked him about his leadership, he always said the same thing. "I just told them where to go. They did the hard part." He refused to take credit for the bomber stream tactics that changed how air warfare worked. He died in 1967 at age 61. Few people outside military circles knew his name. There were no statues built. No movies made about him. He was just another officer who did his job and went home. But his ideas lived on in ways he never saw. When the Cold War started and America and the Soviet Union built massive bomber forces with nuclear weapons, they studied what worked in World War II. The concentrated formation tactics that McEwen perfected became the foundation of Strategic Air Command doctrine. The idea was simple and brutal. If you ever had to bomb someone, send everything at once in one overwhelming wave. Do not spread out. Do not trickle in a few planes at a time. Hit hard, hit fast, hit with such force that the enemy cannot respond. That was pure McEwen strategy adapted for the atomic age. The Lancaster MKX itself became the ancestor of new aircraft. British designers took the lessons learned from its powerful engines and heavy payload capacity and built the Avro Lincoln bomber in 1945. When that became outdated, they built the Avro Shackleton for submarine hunting and patrol missions. These planes served into the 1990s, almost 50 years after the last Lancaster flew a combat mission. The DNA of that Canadian-built bomber lived on in aircraft that protected NATO from Soviet submarines throughout the Cold War. Despite all this effectiveness and influence, the Canadians got little recognition after the war. American history books focused on the 8th Air Force and its daylight raids. Hollywood made movies about B-17 crews flying in the sunshine with fighter escorts. The Memphis Belle became famous. The Enola Gay, which dropped the atomic bomb, was a B-29, but it came from that same American tradition of daylight precision bombing. Canadian contribution got mentioned in a paragraph, maybe two, then forgotten. British histories did the same thing. Bomber command as a whole was controversial. Many British people felt uncomfortable about the destruction of German cities. It was easier to focus on fighter pilots defending Britain during the Battle of Britain than to talk about bombers burning Hamburg and Dresden. The Canadians went home to small towns and farms. They got jobs. They raised families. They did not talk much about what they had done. Post-war Canada did not want to hear war stories. People wanted to move forward, build new lives, forget the darkness. So the story stayed locked inside the men who flew the missions. Their children and grandchildren grew up not knowing that their quiet fathers and grandfathers had flown into hell night after night and somehow survived. The truth started emerging slowly in the 1980s. German veterans began publishing memoirs and giving interviews. They were old men by then, in their 60s and 70s, looking back on their youth. Many had carried guilt and shame for fighting for Nazi Germany. But when they talked about the Canadians, they spoke differently. They spoke with a kind of respect, even admiration, for an enemy who had beaten them fairly through better tactics and greater courage. Wilhelm Jönnin's book became popular in Germany and was translated into English. Hans Joachim Jabs gave interviews where he admitted that Canadian bombers terrified him more than any other aircraft he faced. These admissions from former enemies helped people understand what the Canadians had actually accomplished. The story raises uncomfortable questions that still matter today. Was the bombing of German cities justified? The Canadians dropped 126,000 tons of bombs. Those bombs killed German factory workers. They killed their families. They killed children in schools and old people in hospitals. The moral weight of that destruction cannot be ignored. The Canadians were following orders. They were trying to end a war started by a regime that murdered millions. But does that make the bombing right? History has not settled that question. Perhaps it never will. What we can say is that the Canadians executed their orders with devastating efficiency. They shortened the war. They saved lives by ending the fighting sooner. But they also took lives in numbers that are hard to comprehend. Modern warfare still uses the principles McEwen and his crews proved. When America bombed Iraq in 1991 during the Gulf War, they used overwhelming concentrated force delivered in waves. When NATO bombed Serbia in 1999, they followed the same pattern. Hit everything at once, overwhelm defenses, make resistance impossible. The technology changed from heavy bombers to cruise missiles and stealth fighters, but the strategy remained the same. This is the long shadow cast by those young Canadians flying Lancasters through the darkness over Germany. At a Luftwaffe veterans reunion in the 1970s, someone recorded a conversation among former night fighter pilots. They were drinking beer and telling old war stories. One pilot said something that captured the unique terror of facing the Canadians. "We always knew when the Canadians were coming. The radar looked like a moving mountain range, a solid wall of metal. And we knew most of us would not come back. You could fight Americans and have a chance. You could fight British bombers and have a chance. But the Canadians, they were different. They came in such numbers, with such determination, that trying to stop them was like trying to stop a storm with your bare hands." The Lancaster MKX was not a revolutionary aircraft. It was not faster than jets. It was not more advanced than other bombers. It used technology and ideas that already existed, but it was flown by people who refused to accept that they could not win. That made all the difference. The Canadians took an existing bomber, improved it slightly, and then flew it with such tactical brilliance and raw courage that it became the most feared weapon in the night sky. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not the newest invention or the most expensive technology. Sometimes it is just a good tool used by determined people who will not quit. The Canadians proved that in the dark skies over Germany. They proved it night after night for 2 years. They proved it with 814 aircraft lost and 6,000 lives given. They proved it so completely that 70 years later, German veterans still remembered them with fear and respect. The Black Stream flew into history and changed how wars are fought, and most people never even knew it happened.